Ladies and gentlemen, so glad to see you here. Thank you so much for joining us for Art After Dark at the Norton Museum of Art tonight. My name is Glenn Tomlinson, and I'm the William Randolph Hearst Curator of Education. And the curator conversation that you're about to hear tonight will be delivered by this year's Norton Museum of Art summer interns. This is an incredibly talented group. This is their final day with us. And so we have them working right down to the last hour. But we are all going to miss them. They have been just a great addition to our team here at the Norton this summer. Their internship program, however, began many years ago, back in the 1990s, and it has been sustained with the support provided by the Mr. and Mrs. E. William Aylward Endowment and the Chastain Charitable Foundation Endowment as well. Our talented quartet this summer of recent college graduates and current students have spent the last 7 weeks working on a variety of projects in the education department and other departments around the museum as well. They have led tours for summer campers and for adults. They have worked in the curatorial department doing research, as well as doing research projects for our archivists. They have written press releases. They have worked behind the scenes each week at Art After Dark. They have surveyed our audiences. They have, you name it. They have been working very hard and in a lot of different capacities in our attempt to provide them with as rich and as varied a summer internship as possible. And as I said before, they have just been terrific throughout. But perhaps the project that they've enjoyed the most has been their work on the exhibition that you are enjoying today, posters by Toulouse-Lautrec. And this special exhibition, which they organized, was supported by, and they were given great guidance by Tim Ride, our William and Sarah Ross Soder Curator of Photography, and by Jennifer Laffick, our Curatorial Administrative Assistant. And I'd like to thank both of my colleagues for their great support of our interns this summer. Yes. Our interns are going to give you, each of them has prepared a brief presentation. They will be sharing their insights into the works in the exhibition and the life of Toulouse-Lautrec, as well as the context of his work in the Belle Époque. After their presentation, we hope that you'll all join us in the gallery and ask questions of our speakers there. The gallery is adjacent to the Great Hall, where shortly thereafter a great jazz band will begin to play. But before Allison, Magda, Sarah, and Louis introduce themselves and speak, and by the way, mark their names because you'll be hearing about them in the future, I am sure. I do want to invite Tim Ride to say a few words, and his comments will be followed by others by Jennifer. So Tim?
This will be the shortest curator's conversation I've ever given, which you probably are relieved by. So I just want to remind everybody that when the new season starts and you run into Jan Willinger, please thank her, because all of the posters on view in this exhibition were provided to us by her. They're her private collection. We were at dinner and all of a sudden it just happened and I said, well, why don't you let me take that? And I was feeling pretty good about that because I knew I had an ace that I could play. You know, I'm a curator of photographs, and yes, you can look at the Lautrec posters and say, well, they're very photographic insofar as there are figures that are cut in half, and which is very photographic. But, Jennifer has this really awful title, which is like Curatorial Administrative Assistant or something like that. What you don't know is that Jennifer got her master's from the Courtauld, and she just happens to have studied 19th century European art. So I knew that when I was talking to Jan, I was going to pull Jennifer into this so that I could take all the credit and she could do all the work, which indeed happened. I mean, whenever anything went wrong wrong, I usually say bridge to Jennifer. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. Please remember to thank Jan, but it's my turn now to bridge to Jennifer, who really was the nuts and bolts of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Glenn, for your really lovely introductions. As Tim said, I'm the curatorial assistant here, and I specialized in French art during my master's degree, so really working with these inquisitive, intelligent interns has been the greatest pleasure for me on this project. As Glenn said, we certainly invite you to come into the exhibition to actually see the works and be in Toulouse-Lautrec's world after this exhibition, and for our interns to answer your questions. At the crux of this exhibition, though, is Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec's relationships. And he had so many relationships which are evident in his works. Relationship with lithography as a new printmaking medium, his relationship with colors, with movement, the relationship he had with the women he depicted and how he depicted them, his relationship with Montmartre and the 18th arrondissement of Paris, also the celebrities of Montmartre, of the cabaret scene, including Jane Avril, Yvette Gilbert, and Aristide Bruant, who kind of became this inner circle of his and the cast of characters of his images. But as Tim and I continually met with these interns, it became very clear kind of right away that the relationship that interested them the most was his relationship with us 21st century viewers. And so in their own individual ways, the interns have really challenged our retrospective nostalgia and romanticism that we associate with Toulouse-Lautrec, 19th century Paris, and the Belle Époque especially, so that now we viewers can recontextualize Toulouse-Lautrec in a way that confronts his images in a new light. So with that kind of introduction to our exhibition, I hand over the stage to our wonderful interns, beginning with Allison Marino. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hello. I'm going to move this. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yes? All right. Wonderful. All right. So my name is Allison Marino. As Jennifer said, I am a rising senior at Florida State University, where I study art history and media communication studies. So this has been a very exciting opportunity for me. As we were curating posters by Toulouse-Lautrec, I found myself very interested in the why of the exhibition. So why are we doing posters by Toulouse-Lautrec and not posters by another artist? What gave his posters this richness that made him stand out from his contemporaries? But first, to contextualize his posters a little bit, I want to familiarize you all with lithography. So lithography was a printing medium that really was encouraged or came about in 19th century Paris. Basically, it's based on the premise that oil and water do not mix. So when you when you put something onto a stone, you cover it with a waxy substance, and then you can then repeat it many times onto a paper without altering or compromising the original state of the image on the stone. And because lithography allowed posters to be so mass-produced at this time, and their wide dissemination really perfected the advertising need that performers and these venues in Paris required at this time. Also, lithography gave the images this painterly or artistic effect that kind of satisfied a visual need by Parisians at this time. So Jules Cheret was kind of the father of the modern poster at this time. He invented 3-color lithography, so he introduced red, yellow, and blue into the lithographic process, which kind of gave these posters this artistic, really dynamic feel that started to make them look like fine art and started to make them valued as fine art by society. He influenced artists such as Steinlen, whose poster is showcased in the middle, and this poster right up here, I forget I have a pointer, is just to kind of visualize what it would look like if you were walking down a street in 19th century Paris. I mean, posters were everywhere. Every artist had a hand in lithography, which really just kind of displays how big it was at this time and all the competition or all the other artists that Toulouse-Lautrec was up against. So I argue that Toulouse-Lautrec had a very eclectic novel style, which is one of the reasons that he really stood out from other artists of the time. In short, Toulouse-Lautrec's work is often characterized by large areas of bright, vivid colors, disorienting perspectives, as well as silhouetted and caricature-like depictions of his subjects. So I invite you all to look at his advertisement here for the Moulin Rouge. It features La Goulou, the glutton, in the middle, and she's kind of kicking her leg up at this dance at this anonymous shadowy figure in the foreground, while this very large audience, who is also silhouetted so that we're not distracted by them, stands in the background. But I think this is a perfect example of how Toulouse-Lautrec kind of spliced these artistic elements that you would see in a performance into an artistic way. So obviously, if you were looking at La Goulou performing, you would see her, but probably not perfectly kicking her leg up at this man in the foreground. And you would be distracted by everything else that's going on in the time. So he kind of uses this distorted perspective, I call it, or this flattened composition to push everything to the foreground, to force the viewer to confront what's going on. And in Divan Japonais here, we also see Jane Avril, who, as Jennifer mentioned, was one of his very well depicted subjects as a spectator watching Yvette Gilbert, signified by her long black gloves on stage. And we also see here how the perspective is sort of distorted. We see the band in the midground, but they're probably a little bit more shadowy or bigger than you would see in real life. As well, Toulouse-Lautrec had this way, like I said, of creating these compressed compositions by using large masses of negative space, which separated him from the way that artists traditionally working in art history would use these really deep and complex perspectives to satisfy the intensity that was required by them when they're depicting these mythological or really intense subjects. So on the left here, we have Toulouse-Lautrec's L'Artisan Moderne, and I don't put these two up in terms of subject matter. I think they differ a lot, and that's something I would love to get into in the galleries. But I just want to show here how Toulouse-Lautrec uses this really simplified green colors for the curtains and the comforter, and this kind of large mass of yellow that makes up the wall, whereas Titian, who's one of the greats, uses this really long perspective to recede really back into the background, and then you have obviously his Venus in the foreground, who's a really intense subject in art history, and he also used these really ornamented design-like patterns to convey that complexity, as I mentioned. But Toulouse-Lautrec kind of removes artistic distractions from his work. He tends to use, like I said, these large masses of color and these simplified designs, like these question mark type things that are shown in the comforter in the walls. But you also see him employing some of these things that were traditionally in art history. Like you have this dog as a symbol of fidelity in both pieces, and then you have the woman obviously reclined in bed in the foreground and the two figures in the back. But I just argue that this technique of him kind of compressing the picture plane really separates him from what was seen in art history. So I think another one of the things that separate, or I argue, one of the things that separated Toulouse-Lautrec from other artists was that he drew a lot of inspiration from different styles. So if you Google Toulouse-Lautrec, he's classified in pretty much every way that he could possibly be classified. Some people consider him a post-impressionist because he uses these vivid colors and this picture distortion to evoke emotion from the viewer. Whereas some people think that his dynamic, organic lines, like the question mark we saw in Les Artisans, convey him as an Art Nouveau artist. And then other people depict him or classify him as a modernist because he's depicting this real-life subject matter of performers. But then some people argue that he's a realist because he's doing this. So my point is that he has this eclectic style that kind of refuses classification. And because of that, he's this really interesting character in history because he's pulling all of these elements from different things. But one thing that everyone agrees on is that Toulouse-Lautrec drew a lot of his artistic inspiration from Japanese ukiyo-e prints, as a lot of his contemporaries were doing at the time. So on the right, we see Toulouse-Lautrec's Aristide Bruant for a performance at the El Dorado venue in Paris. This is one of the monumental posters that we have on the show. But there's a really obvious comparison between this poster and then Shiraku's picture of a man who was also very famous in Japan in the 18th century. But we see this really big, intimidating figure pushed to the front of the foreground where in this image we have this large mass of negative gray space that removes the figure from any specific setting or time. And in Toulouse-Lautrec, we see him doing the same thing with, again, this large mass of yellow and this kind of shadowy onlooker to suggest his celebrity status, but not to distract us from the main idea who is Aristide Bruant. So finally, I argue that Toulouse-Lautrec maintained a really special relationship with his subjects. Because he was this aristocrat in Montmartre, he was obviously valued because he was a well-paying patron. But he also had these really interesting physical deformities that kind of separated him and made him really distinguishable by members of Montmartre. So because of this, he easily developed friendships and these close relationships with the performers. He was able to learn their stories, their quirks, their personalities, the things that set them apart. And then I argue that he was able to translate this into his work. So with Jane Avril, for instance, this poster isn't and be seen if you haven't seen it already. But he often depicts her with this kind of trans-like gaze that's representative of the disorder that she suffered from. Yvette Gilbert was often associated with this virgin-like innocent quality. And so in his work, he kind of uses this, I don't even know how to describe it. She's always in a long white dress. She has these long black gloves, and she kind of has this seeming innocence about her. And on the right here, we see Aristide Bruant, who made his living as a satirical poet and comic in Montmartre. So he's often depicted with this really piercing gaze, this intimidating stature that's not afraid to be right there to confront the viewer. So I argue that because Toulouse-Lautrec was able to maintain these really close relationship with his subjects, he depicted them as such and sort of established this viewer-subject relationship whereby an ordinary viewer could look at a poster and kind of gain this artificial celebrity status because they were made to feel like they knew the figure. You know, they were able to distinguish Jane Avril because they saw her face and they knew that was significant of her disorder. So the viewer also felt like they had this intimate, close relationship with his characters, and that really set him apart from other artists of the time. So I invite you all as you look into the exhibition to kind of look for these things. Please reach out if you would like any other information. And as we listen to the rest of the interns give their speeches, I just think this is a really good background to kind of look at Toulouse-Lautrec's art in general. So thank you all.
Hi. My name is Magda. I just graduated from the University of Chicago, and I need to change the slide. I'll be talking about performance and reality. One thing that I was really interested in while I was looking at these prints, a little different from Allison, was that I felt really uncomfortable when I looked at them, and I was really trying to figure out what that might be. So I'm going to lead you through a couple of examples and then conclude or come up with my answer. So this is skating. It was a print from a journal, Le Rire. And on first glance, it looks pretty fun and inviting. It's a skating rink. It's showing us the urban environment that they're living in. You have a nice guy drinking some tea or something, and she's well dressed. And everyone is close together, which is kind of makes you feel like there might be some interaction going on, but no one is talking to anyone. Everyone is in their own separate world. Everyone is really isolated. You see the woman staring between the two men. Oh, I have this. She's like staring right in between the two men. The guy is kind of looking forward, and then the server is walking into a blank wall. Granted, this guy looks like he's having a pretty good time, but there's no interaction between the characters. And the only reason that we think there is interaction is because they are in a space together. So it's like performance, right? When you watch people on a stage in a theater, you think that we suspend disbelief to imagine that they're all in a scene together. And that's what makes the connections. But it's a spectacle. It's not true relationship. And then the second part of this is where we are. We're sitting at this table, and we're barred off by the end of the table. We can't enter the space of the male subject. We also can't enter the space of the female subject because of the railing. So we're in this space where we can only observe. We're not able to go further and participate. We're stuck in the position of observer. This is also something that happens here. But to track back a little bit, I want to talk about the subjects first. So in L'Artisan Moderne, which we already saw with Allison, so I'm going to try and keep this short, this is an advertisement for an interior designer, but what we're seeing is a take on a story where the woman is lovesick and the doctor's going to come somehow heal her. Leave that up to interpretation. But we're not seeing the product. We're not seeing what we're supposed to be buying from the interior designer. We're seeing a story, a fantasy that is supposed to entice us to purchase something. So it, again, isn't reality. It's a performance or a fantasy or it's a spectacle. I'll keep saying those words. And again, we have a zigzag of sightlines. The woman is kind of staring past the man. The artisan is staring maybe towards the maid, and the maid is kind of looking back at him maybe. Oh, and I forgot the dog is looking at her. So it's again zig, 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 zag. There's a sense of confusion as well. That, like Allison said, there's the backwards question marks on the wall, and then the maid is looking really confused too. And it kind of seems to reflect our confusion at us. I completely forgot. There's another character just like that in this one. The lady skating in the background is watching us watch. So it's this observer being observed, and it reflects on our position as the viewer. So same thing here. Our confusion is being reflected at us. And then to go to the point of where we are, we're being watched, or we're being told we're confused, and then we're sitting on the edge of the bed. So we're in the scene, and we're in the scene that kind of has sensual, undertones, though not that undertony. And we're not able to participate. We're stuck on the edge of the bed. We can't go further, but we're in the room. So it kind of, maybe Toulouse-Lautrec is trying to tell us that we're voyeurs as well. So what does that say about performance? What does that say about artwork? Those are questions that, I don't know, are pretty interesting to me. In La Goulue, the last example, we have two dancers facing each other. We can assume that maybe they're looking at each other. Her back is bare, pretty sensual. Their hips are pretty close together. It's a pretty sexy scene, in my opinion. And we're completely stuck on the outside. We're not able to dance with them or anything. We can't see their bodies. Their bodies are really closed off from us. And this, again, keeps us in the position of the viewer or an observer. We're not, dancers. And then all of a sudden, we notice that we're being reflected again. There's this weird, ghostly character that's coming out of the page. Not his whole body isn't even, presented to us. And he's mirroring the way that we're watching the dancers. I've heard some people not even noticing this character because we're watching the dancers, we're watching the action. And so, again, I think another part of this is the way that he's looking at them. The eyes are really droopy and sad, and there's this wish for something that he's not getting, perhaps something sensual again. And so that again brings this idea of us as voyeur to the foreground, and we have to really, as viewers, grapple with that question of what does it mean to be a voyeur in the art world. And it could also relate to Toulouse-Lautrec's life as someone who lived in Montmartre, which was a very performance-heavy district. and with his disabilities wasn't able to engage in dancing or performance so much. He was really stuck on the sidelines, and as an artist he was the documenter of the performers, but again not a participant. And so there is this sense in which it could be a reflection upon himself, but I do think it's bigger than that as well. It's a revelation of the way that modernization and urbanization that was really hyping up the late 19th century Paris was really isolating for a lot of people. The family nucleus was taken apart because you didn't really need a bunch of kids to help you on the farm, and people would be stuck at work a lot. And so there's a sense of isolation that he's really capturing in especially this scene, this urban scene, where no one is really talking to each other. And it also has more implication for us today, where social media is so rampant. We have there's this great thing called Instagram that shows us realities that people are living, but we all know that it's a very curated thing. It's a spectacle that we're supposed to believe, but it never really quite reflects the truth. And so, especially in this period of time where celebrity culture is growing, that means in late 19th century, the late 19th century, it really begs the question of how long has social media had, or how far back do the roots of social media go? And I mean, I think these are pretty good examples of that. So the final question that I would leave you with, as I'd mentioned, the idea of performance and whether it is the closed spaces that help us think of it as performance, or at least helps me think of it as performance, is whether or not the posters in themselves are performances. And I don't think that has an answer, but I think it's a fun one to think about. So thank you. With that, I'll let Sarah, no, Louis. Louis is going on stage.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Let me get my slide before I do anything else. Okay. My name's Louis Jawa. I am a recent graduate of Hamilton College, which is up in Clinton, New York. Just before I start talking, I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to the whole team here, Glenn Tomlinson, Tim Ride, Jennifer, for this really wonderful opportunity. It's been the experience of a lifetime. As you heard Jennifer say earlier, this show ties sort of our four interests together in challenging assumptions, 21st century assumptions about Toulouse-Lautrec and his work. And I approach my subject from a historical perspective, having some background in history. I'm here to confront the term Belle Époque. You'll see that fin de siècle, end of the century, and Belle Époque are often used interchangeably, but Belle Époque meaning the beautiful period, to refer to this period between 1870 and about 1900, has really come to color our understanding of Toulouse-Lautrec and his work in relation to this historical period. Just to get some audience interaction here. Has everybody seen this film? You can raise your hand. This is 2011's Midnight in Paris, a Woody Allen film. In it, this character, played by Marion Cotillard, is from the 1920s in Paris, and she laments that she wants to go back to the Belle Époque when things were more beautiful and life was easier than it is in the 1920s in Paris. Incidentally, here's Toulouse-Lautrec being portrayed right there. But I'm here to pop the sort of the rosy-colored picture that Hollywood has given us. Being from the 1920s, Cotillard's character would not have used the term Belle Époque because it is very much an invention of 1950s American cinema. You'll see An American in Paris, starring Gene Kelly, portrays sort of the all-singing, all-dancing time period of the Belle Époque. This very famous film starring Zsa Zsa Gabor, actually portrays Lautrec himself, The Moulin Rouge of 1953. So this idea is born in a post-World War II Europe where people are looking back to better times before the war. Incidentally, this is a depiction of a dancer called Chocolat that we have in the show, and it is made reference to in the 1951 movie An American in Paris with Gene Kelly. And you'll notice that this is kind of a problematic change in the way that this scene is constructed, because you have all of these racial themes that are being explored in this print here, and in it, in this film, Gene Kelly is giving us a very sort of nostalgic feeling for 1890s Paris. So there are a lot of really wonderful things about 1890s and 80s Paris, but we have to remember that this time period that we're talking about, the 1870s to 1900, is born in the midst of tremendous strife. France loses a war, the Franco-Prussian War against the German Empire. The people of Paris are laid siege to. They have to resort to eating rats and dog meat to survive. And at the end of the Paris Commune in 1870, 200 Parisians are killed. So this is very personal, not just for France, but for Paris itself. Another thing to keep in mind is that print media explodes during this time period. This is a wonderful image by a man named Félix Vallotton, and it's showing us newspapers being read in a cafe in Paris. Of course, newspapers existed before the 1880s, 1890s, but a lot of newspapers are being founded in France at this time. And another crucial thing to remember is that they're all talking to one another. So we might imagine that an article that this gentleman is reading in the front of the composition is being directly responded to by another article in another paper that another gentleman is reading in this scene. And to get back to the Franco-Prussian War and the real trauma that creates for France, there are tremors and aftershocks of that trauma in the 1880s and the 1890s. In 1894, the president of France is assassinated, very publicly assassinated. There's a spate of anarchist bombings in France in the 1890s, and people have this real sense of anxiety and fear about the future. Now, to transition us to Toulouse-Lautrec's work, I had seen this work reproduced many times before, but I did not know the story behind the work itself. It depicts, it's an advertisement, I should say, for a book called Reine de Joie, The Queen of Joy, by a Polish-French author named Victor José. It tells the story of Alice Lamy, this sort of elite Parisian courtesan, prostitute, and her relationship with this man, the fictitious Jewish financier, the Baron de Rosenfeld. And Baron de Rosenfeld is based off of this actual man. He is Baron Alphonse James de Rothschild, one of the richest men in France, and also a Jewish financier. He sued the author of this book, Victor José, for libel after the book came out, because of its anti-Semitic depictions. In the book, this is an actual scene in the book. It's sort of the book scene of high comedy, as it were, and it's a moment in which the Baron has engaged Alice to be his sort of personal partner, and she goes, realizing that he's about to give her this tremendous amount of money, she goes to give him a kiss, and she encounters an obstacle in the form of his large, hooked Semitic nose. It was really kind of this very distasteful joke about Jews. Instead of asking ourselves whether this makes Toulouse-Lautrec an anti-Semite, we should really be asking ourselves the question, I want us to refer back to that Vallotton image with all of the newspapers. How did the press react to this image? How is this image both informing and being informed by popular culture that's developing in the press during this time period. And as with everything in 19th century Paris, in late 19th century Paris, people flocked to write their reviews of this poster, which soon outgrew the fame of the book itself. I'm just going to read the one right here. One reviewer says that the Baron's image is a typical sad-looking Jewish stockbroker, an old lecher who is shown in a state of ruin caused by his debauchery. So there's this real sense of hate and derision that isn't heaped on Alice's character, but on the Baron character of the story. And this fits in with some of the anti-Semitism that's developing in France during the 1880s and especially the 1890s. Jews are blamed for, as a new Jewish class gains a lot of wealth in France and assimilates. Jews are blamed for financial collapse and instability. There are a whole series of political and financial scandals in the 1880s in which Jewish financiers are implicated. There is a newspaper called Le Libre Parole, the Free Word, which becomes the most popular paper in Paris for a time period in the 1890s. It has 400 or 500,000 daily subscribers. Jews are even used as a negative marketing tactic to sell absinthe. This is an anti-Jewish absinthe advertisement. And of course, this is all in the backdrop of the Dreyfus Affair, a famous sort of 18th century or 19th century Paris, O.J. Simpson trial meets Watergate, all tied into one. A Jewish military officer in the French military named Alfred Dreyfus is accused of passing state secrets to Germany. He's court-martialed, he's completely innocent, but there's this massive cover-up, and everybody forms an opinion about not only this incident and Dreyfus's innocence or guilt, but about the place of the Jewish people in France. A lovely image that kind of illustrates the way in which this affair tore France in two is this family dinner image. The patriarch of the family is saying, above all, let's not discuss the Dreyfus Affair, and then, of course, they all discuss it, and a wild brawl ensues between the family members. Although Lautrec did the image of the Reine de Joie, which I talked about earlier, he did have intimate connection with Parisian Jews and Parisian Jewish artisans during the 1890s. This is a man named, is in our exhibition. This is a man named Père Cotel. He's a Jewish master printmaker. He's turning Lautrec's prints out through a printing press that's in Edward Encore's studio. So Lautrec would have worked with Jewish artisans in the Paris of the time period. He also, this is not in our show, but he also did book illustrations for A History of the Jewish People by Georges Clemenceau. So we can see that he has kind of this complicated relationship to some of the things that are happening during the time period. I want to leave us with one last image. This is an image called Debauchery. It advertises a booklet of artist prints that Lautrec and other artists would have been featured in. This central figure here, groping this woman's breast, is his friend Maxime de Thomas, who was a painter and a lithographer himself. And Lautrec actually signed a copy of this print, an advance copy of this print, to de Thomas with sort of a satirical inscription. And this really goes to show that while we might think of the Reine de Joie from a 21st century perspective as, at first, moralizing against covetousness or against vice and prostitution, the really derisive character for Lautrec's audience would have been the Jewish financier. Remarkably, this image was much more controversial within its context than this one. So I invite you to take a look at these images in the gallery, and please approach me if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah Ortiz Monasterio. I recently graduated from the University of Miami, where I studied English literature and art history. One thing that I'm bringing to my presentation this evening is my English literature background. I was a big fan of Shakespeare, still am. And when we began, the interns and we began our research of Toulouse-Lautrec, one thing that really stood out to me was this description of Toulouse-Lautrec as a Joker figure. A scholar from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Colza Ives, once described him as the midget king of the hill, or at the very least, a court jester. So when we continued with our research, I kept thinking about, okay, who is Toulouse-Lautrec and why is he so often described as the Joker? So that is something that we will explore in the next several moments. Okay. So to provide you all with a little bit of background, Toulouse-Lautrec was born into an aristocratic family, and his parents were actually first cousins. And as a result of this, as previously mentioned by my colleagues, he suffered genetic deformities. He broke both of his legs in his early teenage years, and that is what gave that they never healed properly, and he was henceforth a very short man. So this aristocratic upbringing and then this resulting sort of outcast character led him and to the district of Montmartre, which is an area in Paris that was known for its unconventional activities and really its sort of outcast people who were not normally seen as people who were accepted, and this included prostitutes as well. So this duality to his character, somebody who was an aristocrat but found himself living in an area of France that was unconventional, as I said, provided me with a solid grounding to understand perhaps why he is considered the Joker. So, recalling my interest in Shakespeare, a key person in one of Shakespeare's plays, King Lear, and this character is the Fool, the Fool provides this lens through which we can better understand how Toulouse-Lautrec operated and how he interacted with the people he associated with in Montmartre. So on the left over here, we have, this is a reenactment of King Lear. This is Laurence Olivier, and we have here the character of the Fool. And over here to the right, we have Toulouse-Lautrec. And one thing I should note is that in this picture, Toulouse-Lautrec is actually dressed as a clown. He was known to dress in eccentric garb every once in a while. He actually dressed up in the costume of Jane of Real, one of his compatriots. And I think it is interesting that when we hear and often read Toulouse-Lautrec being described as this court jester, to recognize, wow, he was actually dressing up as a clown. So what does that mean? So I want to first examine the relationships that he had with performers, and these performers were often his friends. So on my next slide, I want to present to you two characters. So on the left, we have Jane of Real, which this picture was previously shown in other presentations, and this is a poster that you will find in our exhibition. We have Jane of Real, and then on our right, we have Yvette Gilbert, who is another person with whom he associated. So when I preface these two images, I want to first say that I want to argue that Toulouse-Lautrec adopted the identity, the persona of the Montmartre Joker. He assumed this identity, and it was with this identity that he created his art and also established the relationships that he had with his friends. So Jane of Real was a very close friend of Toulouse-Lautrec's, and she adored his depictions of her and often commissioned him to illustrate her in posters. And she said, it is to Lautrec that I owe my fame. So it was very much this acknowledgement to him that she was achieving the success that she did as a result of his portrayal of her in posters. On the other hand, Yvette Gilbert was not as enthused by his depictions of her, saying, oh my gosh, I look horribly ugly, and Lautrec, you really are a genius at deformity. But nevertheless, in his 1894 album of prints, she was featured, and she autographed these ugly images of her. So that to me is quite curious. Okay, so Gilbert doesn't like it, but she's still signing these prints. What does that mean? Well, when we look at these, I personally think that Drain of Vril is looking pretty good here. She's quite beautiful, as opposed to Yvette Gilbert, who actually looks, in a sense, grotesque. So as an important thing to keep in mind is that Toulouse-Lautrec was these individuals' friends. So at once he is satirizing these individuals, but as he satirizes them, he popularizes them. It's a tango. It's a complex tango of, okay, I'm their friend, I'm gonna poke fun at them, but at the same time, they're gonna achieve success as a result of these images. So that I really do believe is an important aspect of the Joker, this ability to poke fun at others, but also to reveal an important aspect of who they are, which is really what King Lear's fool was doing. He was making fun of his king who committed folly, but was also helping him along his path of self-realization. And in the same vein, Toulouse-Lautrec was satirizing his subjects, but also promoting them and their journey to stardom. Another important aspect of a Joker character in general is that they are not, he or she, the Joker, not only pokes fun at other people, but is able to poke fun at themselves and to expose something about their character, their persona, that they want to critique. Now, with that said, I want to introduce this poster that's on the screen. It is entitled Elle. It was created in 1896, and Elle is actually a publication of posters of prints that Toulouse-Lautrec created based on his experience and actually time spent living in a brothel. And these prints, this publication was actually supposed to be very erotic, and it was not as successful as it originally was intended to be. It was seen as a little bit more beautiful and not as sexy as what the commissioner was hoping for. So in this title print, Elle, we are situated in a bedroom in a brothel, and we see a prostitute here, a woman, with her back turned to us, and then we see a top hat. So, as I said before, a Joker is able to not only poke fun at others, but also poke fun at himself. And I want to recall the fact that Toulouse-Lautrec was an aristocrat, but he was living in this unconventional area and was participating in some risque activities. So, the top hat, right here, is our key symbol. The top hat was worn by a man of the bourgeoisie or the aristocratic class in France, and it is this hat that is a stand-in for a man who would wear the hat. And included in this class of people is Toulouse-Lautrec himself. He was an aristocrat, and we have to keep in mind, he was actually in this figurative bedroom, and it is because he had his wealth that he was able to participate in these unseemly activities. So we are able to acknowledge, okay, he is satirizing himself. He's poking fun at the fact that he has this privilege to be in a brothel and expose it. But keep in mind also, he's not only exposing himself through the top hat, he's also exposing and satirizing his entire class, that of the aristocracy and also of the bourgeoisie. So I would like to conclude with acknowledging that as the Montmartre Joker, Toulouse-Lautrec accomplished two things. He was a critic, but also a popularizer of his friends, the people who were also considered fellow outcasts. And he was also a critic and an affiliate of the aristocratic class of which he was born into. And it's this, as I said earlier, this tango, this duality that enables him to encompass the identity of the Montmartre Joker. He really, at the end of this day, the end of this hour, he was this person who existed in a binary of class, living in an unusual district, but also encompassing the whole fact that he was a member of the aristocratic class. So on that note, I would like to conclude, and I leave you all with the top hat that may be seen in our exhibition posters by Toulouse-Lautrec in the Cox Gallery. Before I leave you all, I would like to reiterate my many thanks to Glenn Tomlinson, to Tim Ride, to Jennifer Laffick, and our wonderful hosts at the Norton Museum of Art this summer. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you to my intern colleagues. Congratulations, it's been a pleasure working with you all. And thank you all so much for being here, for showing your support, and we look forward to speaking with you in the gallery. Thank you.